My daughter chose her biological parents over us for her college graduation after we raised her for 19 years, so I cut her off completely. We're done being her backup family. I'm a 49-year-old man writing this because I don't know what else to do. My wife Elodie, 48F, and I have been married for 23 years. We tried for years to have children but couldn't. After multiple failed treatments and procedures, we accepted that biological children weren't in our future. When I was in college, I had two close friends named Jacob, 48M, and Maria, 47F. They met during our sophomore year and got together quickly. Even back then, they were clear about not wanting kids. Maria would joke about how she could barely keep a plant alive, and Jacob always said he was too selfish to be a father. They got married right after graduation and moved to California for Jacob's tech job. Elodie and I stayed in touch with them over the years. They seemed happy with their child-free lifestyle, traveling constantly and building successful careers. Maria became a marketing executive, and Jacob worked his way up in software development. They sent us pictures from exotic vacations while we were still dealing with fertility treatments. Everything changed when Maria called us one night in tears. She was pregnant at 28, completely unplanned. Jacob got on the phone and said they were keeping the baby but had no idea what they were doing. Over the next few months, we watched our friends fall apart. They fought constantly about everything from baby names to nursery colors. Maria developed severe postpartum depression after their daughter Sophie was born. Jacob worked longer hours to avoid coming home. When Sophie was 6 months old, Jacob and Maria started asking us for help constantly. They would call at midnight asking if it was normal for babies to cry so much. They showed up at our house unannounced with Sophie, saying they needed a break. Elodie and I didn't mind helping. We loved spending time with Sophie and saw how much our friends were struggling. The situation got worse as Sophie got older. Jacob and Maria would drop her off at our house for entire weekends. They missed her first steps because they were at a work conference. When Sophie said her first word, it was at our kitchen table while they were out of town. Elodie and I were there for all her firsts while her parents seemed to be anywhere else. When Sophie turned 2, Jacob and Maria showed up at our door one Friday evening. They said they had a marriage counseling session and needed us to watch Sophie overnight. We agreed, thinking they were finally trying to work things out. Saturday came and went with no word from them. Sunday morning, I called Jacob's phone repeatedly but got voicemail. On Monday, Jacob finally called me back. He was at the airport with Maria, boarding a plane to Seattle. He had accepted a job offer there and they were moving immediately. Then he said something I'll never forget. He told me they realized they weren't cut out to be parents and knew Elodie and I would take good care of Sophie. He said since we always wanted a child and they didn't, this arrangement would work out better for everyone. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, watching 2-year-old Sophie eat cereal at our table, and couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jacob said they would sign over custody to us and that we should consider it a gift. He hung up before I could respond. Elodie came home from work to find me sitting on the floor next to Sophie's high chair. I told her what happened. We spent that entire night talking about what to do. We called child services the next morning and explained the situation. Jacob and Maria had already contacted a lawyer in Seattle and were expediting the custody transfer. The legal process took 3 months. During that time, Jacob called twice to check on paperwork but never asked about Sophie. Maria didn't call at all. They signed away their parental rights without ever coming back to see her. The last time I spoke to Jacob, he said they were starting fresh in Seattle and that we should do the same. Elodie and I adopted Sophie when she was 2.5. We changed her last name to ours and never looked back. She grew up knowing she was adopted but we didn't tell her the full story until she turned 18. We said her biological parents were young and couldn't take care of her, which was true enough. Sophie thrived with us. She played soccer through high school, got good grades, and was accepted to State University 4 hours away. She's studying business and planning to graduate this May. We visited her campus at least once a month since she started college. She comes home for holidays and calls us several times a week. Last October, I got a Facebook message from Jacob. I hadn't heard from him in over 19 years. He said he and Maria were back in town and wanted to meet Sophie. He wrote a long message about how they had grown up and regretted their decision. He said they were financially stable now and wanted to build a relationship with their daughter. I showed the message to Elodie and Sophie. Elodie was against the idea completely. Sophie was curious but nervous. After thinking about it for a week, Sophie said she wanted to meet them once to see what they were like. I arranged the meeting because Sophie felt too awkward to contact them directly. The meeting happened at a coffee shop downtown. Elodie and I waited in the car while Sophie went inside. She was supposed to stay for an hour but didn't come out for 3 hours. When she finally got in our car, she said Jacob and Maria seemed different from what she expected. They apologized for leaving and explained they had built successful careers in Seattle. Jacob now runs his own consulting firm and Maria is a regional director for a major company. Sophie said they wanted to build a real relationship with her and asked if they could meet regularly. She told us she wanted to give them a chance to explain themselves and maybe become part of her life. LOD and I didn't like it, but Sophie was 21 and could make her own decisions. Over the next 6 months, Sophie started having lunch with Jacob and Maria every weekend. They live in an expensive downtown apartment and always take her to nice restaurants. LOD and I can only visit Sophie every other weekend because of the 4-hour drive and our work schedules. Sophie posts pictures on social media from her lunches with Jacob and Maria. They buy her expensive gifts and take her shopping. I started noticing Sophie calling us less frequently. She used to call every few days, but now it's maybe once a week. When we visit, she talks about Jacob and Maria constantly. She tells us about Maria's job and Jacob's business. She mentions places they've taken her and things they've bought her. LOD and I just listen and try to be supportive. 2 weeks ago, Sophie called me about her graduation ceremony. She sounded excited and started talking about the details. I mentioned that LOD had already picked out a dress to wear to the ceremony. That's when Sophie went quiet. She said she needed to tell me something important. The graduation ceremony only allows 2 guests per student. She had given her tickets to Jacob and Maria because she wanted to give them the experience of watching their daughter graduate. She said she hoped LOD and I would understand. I sat in my car in the parking lot at work, holding my phone, not believing what I just heard. Sophie kept talking, explaining how Jacob and Maria had missed everything else and deserved this moment. She said there would be other celebrations where all of us could be together. I hung up without saying anything else. Sophie called back immediately, but I didn't answer. She sent several text messages apologizing and asking me to call her back. I drove home and told LOD what happened. We sat at our kitchen table, the same table where Sophie had eaten breakfast every morning for 19 years, and tried to understand how this could happen. LOD said we needed to make a decision about our relationship with Sophie. She pointed out that Jacob and Maria had given up their rights to be parents 19 years ago and shouldn't get to come back now and take our place. She said if Sophie wanted to choose them over us, then she needed to understand what that choice meant. I called Sophie back the next morning. I told her that LOD and I had raised her, paid for her college, and been there for every important moment in her life. I said if we weren't important enough to be at her graduation, then maybe we weren't important enough to be in her life at all. I told her we were prepared to step back and let Jacob and Maria be her parents since that's what she seemed to want. Sophie started crying and said she didn't mean it that way. She explained that Jacob and Maria had offered to pay off her entire student loan debt if she let them attend the graduation as her parents. She said they also wanted her to visit them in Seattle over the summer to meet Maria's mother, who has dementia and keeps asking about her granddaughter. She said she didn't invite all 4 of us to the graduation because she didn't want to explain her complicated family situation to her friends. She thought it would be easier to just have Jacob and Maria there and celebrate with LOD and me privately later. I told Sophie that her explanation made things worse, not better. I said she was trading our presence at one of the most important days of her life for money and to avoid social embarrassment. I told her our decision stood. If we weren't invited to her graduation, we were done being her parents. Sophie begged me to reconsider, but I told her she had to choose. She could include LOD and me in her graduation, or she could have Jacob and Maria pay her loans, but she couldn't have both. I hung up and haven't answered her calls since. The graduation is in 5 days. LOD and I have accepted that we won't be there. We're trying to figure out what our relationship with Sophie looks like going forward. After 19 years of being her parents, we might have to accept that we were just temporary guardians until her real parents decided they wanted her back. Update 1: It's been 2 weeks since my original post. Thank you to everyone who commented and sent messages. I want to update you on what happened with Sophie's graduation. 3 days after I posted, Sophie called me again. I almost didn't answer, but LOD convinced me to take the call. Sophie was crying and said she had been thinking about everything I said. She told me she realized how selfish she was being and that she had made a terrible mistake. She said she had been trying to get additional tickets to the graduation ceremony but was told it wasn't possible. The university was strict about the 2-ticket limit and there was a waiting list of students who needed tickets. Sophie said she had put her name on the waiting list but wasn't hopeful. I told Sophie that LOD and I appreciated her trying but that the damage was already done. I said even if she got extra tickets, we would feel like unwanted guests at her graduation. I explained that Jacob and Maria would still be there as her chosen parents while LOD and I would be there as an afterthought. Sophie said she understood why I was upset but asked me not to give up on our relationship over one mistake. She said Jacob and Maria had been pressuring her to choose them and that she got caught up in wanting to make everyone happy. She admitted that the money for her student loans was a big factor in her decision. I asked Sophie if she thought LOD and I were stupid. I pointed out that we had been paying her tuition, room, and board for 4 years while Jacob and Maria contributed nothing. Now they were offering to pay her loans in exchange for being her parents at graduation. I told her it seemed like she was auctioning off her family relationships to the highest bidder. Sophie said that wasn't how she saw it, but admitted it looked bad from my perspective. She said Jacob and Maria had a lot of guilt about abandoning her and were trying to make up for lost time. She said they were desperate to be part of her life and would do whatever it took, including paying her debts. I told Sophie that guilt doesn't erase 19 years of absence. I said Elodie and I didn't abandon her when she was 2 years old and come back when it was convenient. We were there for every scraped knee, every school play, every heartbreak, and every success. I said if she wanted Jacob and Maria to be her parents now, then Elodie and I would step aside. Sophie begged me not to make her choose between us. She said she loved Elodie and me but also felt obligated to give Jacob and Maria a chance. She said they had explained how young and scared they were when they left her, and she believed they had changed. I told Sophie that everyone makes mistakes when they're young, but abandoning a 2-year-old child isn't a simple mistake. I said Jacob and Maria made a choice to prioritize their own comfort over their daughter's well-being. I pointed out that they only came back when Sophie was an adult and they wouldn't have to actually parent her. The conversation ended with Sophie promising to keep trying to get extra tickets. She said she would find a way to include Elodie and me in her graduation even if she had to break some rules. 2 days before the graduation, Sophie called with good news. Another student had dropped out of the ceremony at the last minute, and Sophie was able to get 2 additional tickets. She said all 4 of us could attend her graduation and that she wanted to have dinner afterward to talk about everything. Elodie and I were relieved but also suspicious. The timing seemed too convenient, and we wondered if Sophie was lying about how she got the extra tickets. We decided to go to the graduation but planned to keep our distance from Jacob and Maria. The graduation ceremony was held at the university's football stadium. Elodie and I sat in the section for families with last names A through M. Jacob and Maria sat in the section for families with last names N through Z. Sophie's last name is Mitchell, our last name, so technically she should have been in our section. But she had apparently told the university that Jacob and Maria were her parents, so they were seated with her section. During the ceremony, I watched Jacob and Maria take pictures and act like proud parents. Maria cried when Sophie's name was called, and Jacob stood up and cheered. Elodie and I clapped politely but felt like we were watching someone else's daughter graduate. After the ceremony, Sophie found us in the crowd and gave us both long hugs. She looked beautiful in her cap and gown, and I remembered all the times Elodie and I had talked about this day when Sophie was younger. We had imagined being the proud parents in the audience, not feeling like guests at someone else's celebration. Sophie introduced us to some of her friends as her parents, which felt good. But then Jacob and Maria approached our group, and Sophie introduced them as her biological parents who had recently reconnected with her. Her friends looked confused about why she had 2 sets of parents, and Sophie gave a brief explanation about being adopted. One of Sophie's friends asked if it was awkward having everyone there together. Sophie laughed and said it was complicated but that she was glad everyone could be there. I noticed that Jacob and Maria stayed close to Sophie throughout all the conversations, as if they were staking their claim. We all went to dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. Jacob insisted on picking up the check, which annoyed me because it felt like another way for him to show off his wealth. During dinner, Maria talked about her job and their life in Seattle. She mentioned their expensive apartment and their recent vacation to Europe. Sophie seemed impressed by their lifestyle and asked lots of questions about Seattle. Jacob offered to show her around the city if she ever wanted to visit. Maria said she would love to have Sophie stay with them for a few weeks over the summer. Elodie and I mostly listened to the conversation. We felt out of place at this dinner celebrating our daughter's graduation. Jacob and Maria dominated the conversation and acted like they had been part of Sophie's life all along. Toward the end of dinner, Sophie said she had something to tell all of us. She said she had been thinking about her future and had decided to move to Seattle after graduation. Jacob had offered her a job at his consulting firm, and Maria said she could help Sophie find her own apartment. Elodie dropped her fork and stared at Sophie. I asked Sophie when she had made this decision. She said she had been considering it for a few weeks and that Jacob and Maria's offer was too good to pass up. She said she could start her career in Seattle and also build a relationship with her biological parents. I asked Sophie what about her job interviews in our city. She had been interviewing with several companies near our home and had told us she was excited about staying close to family. She said those opportunities weren't as good as what Jacob was offering. Elodie asked Sophie if she had thought about how this would affect us. Sophie said she knew we would miss her but that Seattle wasn't that far away. She said she could visit us regularly and that we could visit her in Seattle. Jacob said he was excited to have Sophie close by and that he looked forward to teaching her about the business world. Maria said she had already started looking at apartments for Sophie and had found several nice options. The dinner ended with Sophie excited about her new plans and Elodie and I sitting quietly. We drove back to our hotel without talking much. Elodie finally said she felt like we had just lost our daughter twice, once when she was 2 and again when she was 22. The next morning, Sophie came to our hotel to say goodbye before we drove home. She thanked us for coming to her graduation and said she was sorry about all the confusion with the tickets. She said she hoped we could support her decision to move to Seattle. I told Sophie that she was an adult and could make her own choices. I said Elodie and I would always love her, but that we were disappointed she was choosing to move across the country to be with people who had abandoned her as a child. Sophie said she wasn't choosing Jacob and Maria over us. She said she was choosing an opportunity to build relationships with both her adoptive and biological parents. She said she hoped we could all be one big family. Elodie told Sophie that families don't work that way. She said you can't abandon a child and then come back 19 years later expecting equal treatment with the people who raised her. She said Jacob and Maria had given up their right to be Sophie's parents when they signed away custody. Sophie said she understood our perspective but asked us to try to understand hers. She said she had always wondered about her biological parents and now she had a chance to know them. She said she didn't want to waste that opportunity. We said goodbye to Sophie at the hotel. Elodie cried during the entire 4-hour drive home. I kept thinking about how we had raised Sophie from age 2, sent her to college, and watched her graduate, only to have her choose her biological parents in the end. Sophie moved to Seattle 3 weeks ago. She calls us once a week and sends pictures of her new apartment and job. She seems happy with her decision. Elodie and I are trying to adjust to having an empty house and wondering if we'll ever feel like Sophie's real parents again. Update 2: It's been 3 months since Sophie moved to Seattle, and I wanted to update everyone on how things have been going. A lot has happened since my last post, and I'm not sure how to process all of it. Sophie called us regularly for the first month after moving. She would tell us about her job at Jacob's consulting firm and her new apartment. She seemed to be adjusting well to life in Seattle and building relationships with Jacob and Maria. Elodie and I tried to be supportive, but it was hard to listen to her talk about her new life with her biological parents. In August, Sophie called to tell us she was planning to take a trip to Germany with Maria. She explained that Maria's mother, who has Alzheimer's disease, had been asking about her granddaughter. Maria wanted to take Sophie to meet her grandmother before the disease progressed further. Sophie was excited about the trip and said she had never been to Europe. She said Maria was paying for everything and that they would be gone for 2 weeks. Elodie and I wished her a safe trip, but I couldn't help thinking about how Jacob and Maria were giving Sophie experiences we could never afford. While Sophie was in Germany, we didn't hear from her much. She sent a few text messages and some pictures from tourist sites, but she seemed busy with sightseeing and spending time with Maria's family. Elodie and I went about our normal routines, but the house felt especially empty knowing Sophie was so far away. When Sophie returned from Germany, she called to tell us about her trip. She said Maria's mother was in worse condition than expected and didn't really recognize Sophie as her granddaughter. But Sophie said she was glad she went and that she felt closer to Maria after spending so much time together. Sophie also mentioned that she had been thinking about her future career plans. She said working at Jacob's firm was good experience, but she wasn't sure if consulting was right for her long term. She said she was considering going back to school for her master's degree. A few weeks later, Sophie called with surprising news. She said she had been accepted to a graduate program at University of Washington and planned to start in January. She said Jacob and Maria were supportive of her decision and had offered to help pay for her education. Elodie asked Sophie if she had considered applying to graduate schools closer to home. Sophie said she had thought about it but decided to stay in Seattle since she was already established there. She said the program at UW was exactly what she wanted to study. I asked Sophie how she got accepted so quickly since most graduate programs require months of preparation and applications. Sophie said Jacob had connections at the university and was able to help her get a meeting with the admissions department. She said her undergraduate grades were good enough to get accepted quickly. This bothered me because it seemed like Jacob was using his influence to smooth Sophie's path, just like he had done with a job offer. I wondered if Sophie was getting these opportunities because of her merit or because Jacob had money and connections. In September, Sophie called with more news about her plans. She said she had decided to sell her car because she wouldn't need it in Seattle. She also mentioned that she was thinking about changing her last name back to her biological parents' name. Elodie was quiet during this phone call, but I could tell she was upset. After we hung up, Elodie said she felt like Sophie was erasing us from her life piece by piece. First she moved across the country, then she started planning her future around Jacob and Maria, and now she wanted to change back to their name. I called Sophie back the next day to ask about the name change. She said it wasn't personal against Elodie and me, but that she felt disconnected from the Mitchell name. She said since she was building a relationship with Jacob and Maria, it made sense to share their name again. I told Sophie that the Mitchell name represented 19 years of her life with Elodie and me. I said changing her name felt like she was rejecting the family that raised her. Sophie said she wasn't rejecting us but that she wanted to honor her biological family too. We had several more conversations about the name change over the following weeks. Sophie seemed determined to go through with it, despite our objections. She said it was her legal right to change her name and that she hoped we would understand. In October, Sophie called to tell us she had officially changed her name back to Sophie Romano, Jacob and Maria's last name. She said the process was easier than she expected and that she was happy with her decision. She said she hoped Elodie and I could accept her choice. Elodie was devastated by this news. She said it felt like Sophie was officially choosing Jacob and Maria over us. She said the name change was symbolic of Sophie rejecting everything we had given her. I told Sophie that Elodie and I were hurt by her decision but that we respected her right to make her own choices. I said we hoped she was happy with her new life in Seattle and her reconnection with her biological parents. Around the same time, Sophie posted pictures on social media from a family dinner with Jacob and Maria. The caption said she was grateful to be building relationships with her real parents. Several of our friends saw the post and asked us about it. Elodie deleted her social media accounts after seeing Sophie's post. She said she couldn't handle seeing Sophie refer to Jacob and Maria as her real parents when we were the ones who had raised her. In November, Sophie called to tell us she had some difficult news to share. She said Jacob had been diagnosed with early-stage cancer and would be starting treatment soon. She said the diagnosis had brought their family closer together and that she wanted to be there to support him. Sophie said she had decided to defer her graduate school admission for a year so she could help Jacob through his treatment. She said Maria was overwhelmed with the diagnosis and needed Sophie's support. Elodie and I were concerned about Jacob's health, despite our complicated feelings about him. We told Sophie we hoped he would recover quickly and that we understood her desire to help her biological family during this difficult time. Sophie thanked us for being understanding and said she appreciated our support. She said Jacob and Maria were grateful to have her nearby during this challenging period. Over the next few weeks, Sophie called less frequently. When she did call, she mostly talked about Jacob's treatment and how Maria was handling the stress. She seemed completely focused on her biological family's crisis and rarely asked about our lives. Elodie and I started to realize that we had become secondary figures in Sophie's life. She called us out of obligation, but her real emotional investment was with Jacob and Maria. We were the adoptive parents she checked in with occasionally, while they were her primary family. Last week, Sophie called to tell us that Jacob's treatment was going well and that his prognosis looked good. She said the experience had made her realize how important family is and how grateful she was to have reconnected with her biological parents. She said she had been thinking about Elodie and me too and wanted us to know that she still loved us. She said she hoped we could all find a way to be family together, even if it looked different than traditional families. I told Sophie that Elodie and I would always love her, but that we were struggling with feeling like we had been replaced in her life. I said it seemed like Jacob and Maria had become her real parents while we were just people from her past. Sophie said that wasn't how she saw it, but I could tell she was more invested in her relationship with Jacob and Maria than with us. She had built a new life in Seattle centered around her biological family, and Elodie and I were becoming more distant figures. The conversation ended with Sophie promising to call more often and visit us soon. But I don't think things will go back to how they were before Jacob and Maria returned to her life. Sophie has chosen her biological family, and Elodie and I need to accept that our role as her parents has ended. Update 3. It's been 6 months since my last update, and I'm writing this final post to close out this chapter of our lives. A lot has changed since Sophie moved to Seattle, and Elodie and I have had to make some difficult decisions about our relationship with her. In December, Sophie called to invite us to spend Christmas with her in Seattle. She said Jacob and Maria wanted to host all of us for the holidays as one big family. She seemed excited about the idea and said it would be a chance for everyone to spend time together. Elodie and I talked about the invitation for several days. We hadn't seen Sophie since her graduation 7 months earlier, and we missed her. But the idea of spending Christmas as guests in Jacob and Maria's home felt wrong to us. I called Sophie back and told her we appreciated the invitation but would prefer to spend Christmas at our own home. I said if she wanted to visit us for the holidays, she was welcome, but we weren't comfortable being guests at Jacob and Maria's family celebration. Sophie seemed disappointed by our decision. She said she had hoped we could all be together for her first Christmas in Seattle. She said Jacob and Maria were looking forward to meeting us properly and getting to know us better. I told Sophie that Elodie and I weren't interested in getting to know Jacob and Maria better. I said we had accepted that Sophie wanted them in her life, but that didn't mean we had to become friends with the people who abandoned her as a child. Sophie said she wished we could be more open-minded about Jacob and Maria. She said they had changed since she was little and that they genuinely regretted their past mistakes. She said they wanted to make amends with Elodie and me. I told Sophie that some mistakes can't be undone by apologies and good intentions. I said Jacob and Maria had given up their right to be part of our family when they signed away custody 20 years ago. Sophie ended up spending Christmas in Seattle with Jacob and Maria. She sent us pictures from their celebration, and we could see how much she enjoyed being part of their family traditions. Elodie and I spent Christmas alone for the first time in 20 years. In January, Sophie started her graduate program at University of Washington. She called to tell us about her classes and professors, but our conversations felt strained. We were running out of things to talk about since our lives were moving in different directions. Around the same time, Sophie posted more pictures on social media with Jacob and Maria. In one post, she wrote about how grateful she was to have found her real family and how much her life had changed since reconnecting with her biological parents. LOD saw the post and decided she couldn't handle seeing Sophie refer to Jacob and Maria as her real family while we were treated like distant relatives. She asked me to stop showing her Sophie's social media posts. In February, Sophie called with news that felt like the final break in our relationship. She said Jacob had offered to make her a partner in his consulting firm after she finished graduate school. She said it was an amazing opportunity that would set her up for life. Sophie also mentioned that she and Maria had been talking about Sophie getting married someday. She said Maria wanted to help plan her wedding and that they had already started looking at venues in Seattle. I asked Sophie if she had thought about LOD and me being part of her wedding planning. Sophie was quiet for a moment and then said she hadn't really considered it. She said Maria was so excited about helping with wedding plans that Sophie didn't want to complicate things. I told Sophie that her answer said everything I needed to know about where LOD and I stood in her life. I said it was clear that Jacob and Maria had become her real parents and that we were just people from her past. Sophie tried to argue that she still considered us family, but her actions spoke louder than her words. She was building her entire future around Jacob and Maria while LOD and I had become afterthoughts. I told Sophie that LOD and I wished her well in her new life, but that we couldn't continue pretending to be her parents when she had clearly chosen replacements. I said we would always love her, but that we were stepping back from the relationship. Sophie cried and begged me not to give up on our family. She said she never meant to hurt us and that she loved us just as much as Jacob and Maria. But I could tell she was saying what she thought we wanted to hear, not what she actually felt. I told Sophie that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day. I said her choices over the past year had shown LOD and me that we weren't her priority anymore. The conversation ended with Sophie promising to think about everything I had said. She said she would try to do better at including LOD and me in her life. But nothing changed after that conversation. Sophie continued building her life around Jacob and Maria while maintaining minimal contact with us. She called once a month out of obligation, but our relationship felt hollow. Last month, LOD and I made the decision to stop reaching out to Sophie entirely. We realized that we were putting more effort into the relationship than she was, and it was causing us too much pain. We haven't spoken to Sophie in 6 weeks. She hasn't called or texted to check on us, which confirms that we made the right decision. She's clearly moved on with her biological family, and LOD and I need to accept that our time as her parents has ended. LOD and I are focusing on our own lives now. We're planning some trips we never took while Sophie was growing up. We're reconnecting with friends we lost touch with during the busy years of parenting. It's strange having an empty house after 20 years of being parents. But we're learning to enjoy our freedom and independence. We gave Sophie everything we had for 2 decades, and we don't regret that choice. Sophie is 22 years old now and has made her decision about who she wants as her family. LOD and I raised her to be independent and make her own choices, and that's exactly what she's done. We'll always love the little girl we adopted when she was 2 years old. But that little girl is gone, and the woman she became has chosen a different family. LOD and I need to respect that choice and move forward with our own lives. Sometimes I wonder if Sophie will regret her decision someday. Maybe when she has children of her own, she'll understand what LOD and I sacrificed to raise her. But that's not our concern anymore. We did our job as parents. We raised Sophie to be a successful, independent adult. The fact that she chose to build her life around other people doesn't diminish what we accomplished. LOD and I are at peace with our decision to step back. We can't force someone to appreciate what we did for them, and we won't spend the rest of our lives begging for scraps of attention from someone who has moved on. This is my final update on this situation. LOD and I are closing this chapter of our lives and starting a new one without Sophie. We wish her well, but we're done being her backup parents while Jacob and Maria get to be her real family.